Welcome back to Bible Shorts, Episode 11, The Baby War. Well, remember in last week's episode, we learned how Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah instead of Rachel. And then he had to work another 7 years to get Rachel as well, right? So now we've got two sisters married to Jacob, and they don't get along. And one of the big reasons is Leah repeatedly gets pregnant. She has like 4 boys. And Rachel is so upset. She goes to Jacob and says, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob became very angry with Rachel and said, "Am I in the place of God?" And then Rachel pulls the same thing that Sarah did. Remember when Sarah couldn't get pregnant? Remember, Sarah gave Abraham her servant Hagar, and Hagar had a son called Ishmael. Rachel pulls the same thing. Rachel gives her maid Bilhah as a wife to Jacob, and Bilhah then gives Jacob 2 sons. Well, Leah had apparently stopped having kids, and so she gets in the act and she goes, and she gives Jacob her maid, and that maid has 2 children. And at this point you think, baby wars. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? The next thing that happens is there's a fight over some mandrakes that Leah's oldest son had found in the fields during the wheat harvest and brought to his mom. And Rachel sees them and goes, "Oh, give me some of those mandrakes." And Leah snaps at her and basically says, "It's not enough that, my husband loves you best, but you've got to take my son's mandrakes too." I mean, really, they're fighting over food. And basically, Rachel says, "Well, yeah, you can sleep with Jacob again if you give me the mandrakes." Are you kidding me? They make a bargain, and that's exactly what happens. Rachel gets the mandrakes, and Leah sleeps with her husband, Jacob, and guess what? More kids. And still, Rachel has no children. Then finally, Rachel gets pregnant and gives birth to a son that they name Joseph. Yeah, you may recognize that name, right? Joseph in the coat of many colors, who saves his entire family from a terrible famine. We'll get to that story soon. But why else are we talking about all these children and their names and what difference does it make? Well, the 4th son of Leah, his name is Judah. And a couple hundred years later, in a small farming village called Bethlehem, in an area that was called Judah, because the people in that area considered themselves descendants of Judah, Jacob and Leah's son, there is born in Bethlehem a shepherd boy called David. He grows up and he kills a giant called Goliath, and David eventually becomes the 2nd king of Israel. And then 1,000 years later, also in Bethlehem, is born a baby boy to a mother named Mary and her husband Joseph, whose families were originally from the tribe of Judah. And his name is Jesus. So that's one of the reasons We have Genesis in our Bible because it tells the story, the family story of how God uses ordinary people, people who aren't perfect, to create a chosen people and eventually a nation and a people and a place where His Son, the Messiah, can be born. Isn't that just cool? Okay, see you next week. Look for episode 12, Time to Depart.